Question 1. Comparative studies suggest that the effectiveness of security awareness training can vary significantly based on its design and implementation. A certified security specialist, CSS, is tasked with developing a new security awareness training program for a financial services firm operating under U.S. regulatory frameworks. The firm has a limited budget for training initiatives. Which of the following approaches would best align with the regulatory requirements for effective security awareness training in this context? Option A. Develop a comprehensive training program that prioritizes content based on a thorough risk assessment of the firm's specific vulnerabilities and threat landscape, incorporating interactive elements and regular phishing simulations to measure comprehension and behavioral change. Option B. Implement a broad, general security awareness training module covering common cyber threats, delivered annually through a standardized online platform with no specific focus on the firm's unique operational risks. Option C. Rely solely on a one-time, mandatory online training session at the time of employee onboarding, with no ongoing reinforcement or updates to the training content. Option D. Focus the training exclusively on technical security controls and procedures, assuming that employees will understand the broader security implications without explicit instruction on human factor risks. Correct answer is A. Develop a comprehensive training program that prioritizes content based on a thorough risk assessment of the firm's specific vulnerabilities and threat landscape, incorporating interactive elements and regular phishing simulations to measure comprehension and behavioral change. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the practical realities of resource constraints with the absolute necessity of meeting regulatory compliance and fostering a robust security culture. The Certified Security Specialist, CSS, must demonstrate an understanding of how to implement effective security awareness training that is not only compliant but also impactful and sustainable, even with limited resources. Careful judgment is required to prioritize training content and delivery methods that yield the greatest security benefit while adhering to the specified regulatory framework. The correct approach involves a risk-based methodology for tailoring security awareness training. This means identifying the most critical threats and vulnerabilities relevant to the organization's specific context, and then focusing training efforts on those areas. This approach is justified by the regulatory framework, which mandates that security awareness training be effective and relevant to the organization's risks. By prioritizing based on risk, the organization ensures that limited resources are allocated to address the most significant security gaps, thereby maximizing compliance and reducing the likelihood of security incidents. This aligns with the principle of due diligence in security management. An approach that focuses solely on generic, widely applicable security topics without considering the organization's specific threat landscape is incorrect. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for effective training because it may not address the most pertinent risks, leading to a false sense of security and potential compliance gaps. Furthermore, it can lead to employee disengagement as the training may be perceived as irrelevant to their daily tasks. An approach that relies exclusively on automated, one-size-fits-all online modules without any form of reinforcement or assessment is also professionally unacceptable. While efficient, such an approach may not adequately gauge comprehension or retention, failing to ensure that employees truly understand and can apply the security principles. The regulatory framework often implies a need for demonstrable understanding, not just passive consumption of information. Finally, an approach that neglects to involve management in the security awareness training program is flawed. Without management buy-in and visible support, the training is less likely to be taken seriously by employees, undermining its effectiveness and potentially leading to a culture where security is not a shared responsibility. This can create a disconnect between stated security policies and actual employee behavior, posing a significant compliance risk. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough risk assessment to identify the organization's unique security challenges. This assessment should inform the development of a training strategy that prioritizes content and delivery methods based on risk mitigation. Regular evaluation of training effectiveness through metrics such as phishing simulation results, incident reporting rates, and employee feedback is crucial. Furthermore, fostering a culture of continuous improvement by adapting the training program based on evolving threats and organizational needs is paramount. Management engagement should be an integral part of the strategy from its inception. Question 2. System analysis indicates that a critical financial data processing system is currently protected by a single-factor password authentication mechanism for all user access, including administrative functions. The system logs all user activities. A recent penetration test revealed that compromised credentials could grant broad access to sensitive financial information and system configuration settings. Given the regulatory landscape for financial institutions in the United States, which of the following approaches would best address the identified vulnerabilities and ensure compliance? Option A. Upgrade the password complexity requirements and implement a policy for more frequent password changes. Option B. Focus on improving the logging and auditing capabilities to capture all user actions in greater detail for post-incident analysis. Option C. Implement a robust intrusion detection system, IDs, to monitor for suspicious activity and alert security personnel. Option D. Implement multi-factor authentication, requiring at least 2 distinct factors for all privileged user access, and enhance network access controls to segment administrative functions. The correct answer is D. Implement multi-factor authentication, requiring at least 2 distinct factors for all privileged user access, and enhance network access controls to segment administrative functions. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in security operations where a critical system relies on robust AAA mechanisms. The professional challenge lies in balancing the need for stringent security controls with operational efficiency and user experience. A misconfiguration or an inadequate implementation of AAA can lead to significant security vulnerabilities, unauthorized access, data breaches, or denial of service, all of which carry substantial regulatory and financial repercussions. The Certified Security Specialist, CSS, must demonstrate a deep understanding of how AAA principles translate into practical, compliant security solutions. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves implementing a multi-factor authentication, MFA solution that requires at least 2 independent factors from different categories, e.g., something the user knows, something the user has, something the user is for privileged access. This aligns with best practices and regulatory expectations for protecting sensitive systems. Specifically, in the context of U.S. federal regulation, frameworks like NIST SB 800-53, which is often referenced in CSS examinations concerning U.S. compliance, mandate strong authentication controls, particularly for systems processing sensitive information. The principle of least privilege, a cornerstone of authorization, is also implicitly addressed by ensuring only authenticated and authorized individuals can access critical functions. Accounting, the third pillar of AAA, ensures that all access and actions are logged, providing an audit trail for accountability and incident investigation. This comprehensive approach directly addresses the identified vulnerabilities by significantly raising the bar for unauthorized access. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing single-factor authentication based solely on a password, even a complex one, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Many U.S. regulations, including those governing financial institutions, e.g., GLBA, and healthcare, e.g., HIPAA, explicitly or implicitly require stronger authentication than just passwords for accessing sensitive data or systems. This approach fails to meet the defense in depth principle and leaves the system vulnerable to credential stuffing, phishing, and brute force attacks. Relying solely on network-based access controls without robust user authentication is another failure. While network segmentation and firewalls are important layers of defense, they do not authenticate individual users. An attacker who gains network access could then potentially exploit systems without proper user-level authentication. This bypasses the core principles of AAA, particularly authentication and authorization at the user level. Implementing a system that logs all user actions but does not enforce strong authentication or authorization is also insufficient. While comprehensive accounting is valuable for forensics, it is reactive rather than proactive. Without strong authentication and authorization, the logs will simply record unauthorized access and actions, failing to prevent them in the first place. This approach prioritizes detection over prevention, which is a critical deficiency in protecting sensitive systems. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing similar situations should first conduct a thorough risk assessment to identify critical assets and potential threats. This assessment should inform the selection of appropriate AAA controls. The next step is to consult relevant regulatory frameworks and industry best practices, e.g., NIST, CIS controls to ensure compliance and effectiveness. When designing or reviewing AAA implementations, always consider the principle of least privilege for authorization and the need for robust, multi-factor authentication for privileged access. Finally, ensure that comprehensive accounting mechanisms are in place to provide an auditable trail of all system activities. The decision-making process should prioritize prevention of unauthorized access through strong authentication and authorization, supported by thorough accounting. Question 3. Regulatory review indicates that a certified security specialist, CSS, is tasked with developing a threat model for a new cloud-based financial application. The organization has limited resources for security remediation. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory expectations for effective threat modeling and resource allocation? Option A. Address threats based on the urgency expressed by individual department heads, prioritizing those with the most vocal concerns. Option B. Focus on addressing the most technically complex and novel attack vectors, as these represent the most sophisticated threats. Option C. Allocate resources to mitigate threats that are frequently discussed in industry news, regardless of their specific relevance to the application. Option D. Prioritize threats based on their potential impact on critical business functions and the likelihood of their occurrence, using a structured risk assessment framework. The correct answer is D. Prioritize threats based on their potential impact on critical business functions and the likelihood of their occurrence, using a structured risk assessment framework. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for robust security controls with the practical constraints of resource allocation and the potential for operational impact. A certified security specialist, CSS, must make a judgment call that is not only technically sound, but also compliant with relevant regulations and ethical standards. The core challenge lies in prioritizing security efforts when faced with limited resources and diverse threat landscapes. The correct approach involves systematically identifying, analyzing, and prioritizing threats based on their potential impact and likelihood, using a structured decision-making framework. This aligns with the principles of risk management, which are often mandated or strongly encouraged by regulatory bodies. By focusing on the most critical threats first, the CSS ensures that resources are deployed effectively to mitigate the highest risks, thereby demonstrating due diligence and a commitment to protecting sensitive information and systems. This proactive and evidence-based methodology is essential for meeting regulatory obligations related to data protection and security assurance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the most technically sophisticated or novel threats, regardless of their actual likelihood or impact on the organization, fails to adhere to a risk-based methodology. This can lead to misallocation of resources, leaving the organization vulnerable to more common or impactful threats. It also risks non-compliance with regulations that require a proportionate response to identified risks. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes threats based on the loudest internal stakeholder requests, without a formal risk assessment, is also professionally unacceptable. This approach is subjective, prone to bias, and does not guarantee that the most significant security risks are being addressed. It can lead to a reactive security posture rather than a proactive one, and may not satisfy regulatory requirements for a systematic and documented risk management process. Furthermore, an approach that neglects to consider the potential impact of a threat on business operations and data confidentiality, focusing only on the technical exploitability, is flawed. Regulations often emphasize the protection of data and the continuity of business operations. Ignoring these aspects in threat prioritization can lead to significant compliance failures and business disruption. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the organizational context, including business objectives, critical assets, and existing security controls. 2. Employing a recognized threat modeling methodology, e.g., IDPASTA DREAD to systematically identify potential threats. 3. Quantifying or qualitatively assessing the likelihood and impact of each identified threat. 4. Prioritizing threats based on a defined risk matrix or scoring system, considering regulatory requirements and business impact. 5. Documenting the threat model, risk assessment, and prioritization decisions. 6. Communicating findings and recommendations to relevant stakeholders. 7. Regularly reviewing and updating the threat model as the threat landscape and organizational environment evolve. Question 4. Consider a scenario where a certified security specialist, CSS, is tasked with enhancing the information security posture of an organization operating within a jurisdiction that mandates adherence to specific data protection laws and industry best practices. The organization has a foundational understanding of security, but lacks a structured management system. The specialist is evaluating different approaches to framework implementation. Which approach best balances comprehensive risk management with actionable control implementation, while remaining compliant with typical regulatory expectations for a CSS professional? Option A. Select individual security controls from both ISO 27001 and NIST based on perceived common requirements, without a documented risk assessment or a cohesive management system framework. Option B. Implement an ISO 27001 compliant information security management system, ISMS, and then map its control objectives to the detailed guidance and specific controls found in a relevant NIST special publication, such as NIST SB 800-53, to address specific regulatory and operational requirements. Option C. Solely implement the controls outlined in ISO 27001, assuming that its broad principles will inherently satisfy all regulatory and operational security needs without further specific mapping. Option D. Exclusively adopt a NIST framework, such as the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, focusing on implementing its core functions and categories without establishing a formal ISMS or explicitly linking controls to a documented risk management process. The correct answer is B. Implement an ISO 27001 compliant information security management system, ISMS, and then map its control objectives to the detailed guidance and specific controls found in a relevant NIST special publication, such as NIST SB 800-53, to address specific regulatory and operational requirements. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a security specialist to balance the comprehensive, risk-based approach of ISO 27001 with the prescriptive, foundational controls often found in NIST frameworks, while adhering strictly to the regulatory landscape relevant to the Certified Security Specialist, CSS, exam. The challenge lies in selecting the most appropriate framework implementation strategy that aligns with both industry best practices and the specific compliance obligations implied by the CSS certification's jurisdiction. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the chosen approach is not only technically sound, but also legally and ethically defensible within the defined regulatory context. The correct approach involves integrating the core principles of ISO 27001, such as establishing an information security management system, ISMS, with a strong emphasis on risk assessment and management, and then mapping these controls to the more granular, actionable guidance provided by a relevant NIST special publication, e.g., NIST SB 800-53 for federal systems, or NIST CSF for critical infrastructure. This hybrid approach leverages the strategic, top-down nature of ISO 27001 for overall security governance and the detailed, practical implementation guidance of NIST for specific control selection and deployment. This is professionally sound because it demonstrates an understanding of multiple leading frameworks and the ability to synthesize them into a cohesive, risk-informed security program that meets diverse compliance needs. The regulatory justification stems from the expectation that security professionals will adopt a robust, adaptable, and evidence-based approach to information security, which this integration facilitates. Ethically, it prioritizes the protection of information assets through a comprehensive and well-justified methodology. An incorrect approach would be to solely implement ISO 27001 without considering specific regulatory mandates or industry-specific guidance that might be better addressed by NIST controls. This fails to acknowledge that, while ISO 27001 provides a management system, it may not offer the detailed technical or procedural controls required by certain regulations or operational environments. The regulatory failure lies in potentially overlooking specific compliance requirements that are explicitly detailed in NIST publications or other jurisdiction-specific laws. Ethically, this approach could lead to gaps in security that expose the organization to undue risk, failing the duty of care. Another incorrect approach would be to exclusively adopt a NIST framework without establishing a formal ISMS as prescribed by ISO 27001. This often results in a collection of implemented controls without a clear governance structure, risk management process, or continuous improvement cycle. The regulatory failure here is the lack of a systematic, management-driven approach to security, which is often a prerequisite for demonstrating due diligence and compliance in many regulatory environments. Ethically, this can lead to a reactive security posture rather than a proactive one, potentially leaving critical vulnerabilities unaddressed due to a lack of overarching strategic oversight. A third incorrect approach would be to cherry-pick controls from both ISO 27001 and NIST without a coherent strategy or risk-based justification. This checklist mentality, often driven by perceived compliance requirements rather than a genuine understanding of risks, leads to an inefficient and potentially ineffective security program. The regulatory and ethical failure is the absence of a demonstrable risk assessment process and a clear rationale for control selection, which undermines the credibility of the security program and its ability to protect information assets effectively. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the specific regulatory and legal obligations of the jurisdiction relevant to the CSS certification. 2. Conducting a thorough risk assessment to identify critical information assets and potential threats. 3. Evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of relevant security frameworks, e.g., ISO 27001 for ISMs, NIST for detailed controls, in the context of identified risks and regulatory requirements. 4. Developing a hybrid strategy that integrates the most effective elements of chosen frameworks, ensuring a risk-based, comprehensive, and compliant security program. 5. Documenting the rationale for all security decisions and control selections. Question 5. Quality control measures reveal that a new collaborative software platform is being considered for adoption across the organization. This platform will allow employees to share documents, code snippets, and design schematics. As a certified security specialist, CSS, what is the most appropriate initial step to ensure the organization's intellectual property rights are adequately protected during the evaluation and potential implementation of this software? Option A. Implement broad, restrictive access controls and data loss prevention policies across all organizational systems to minimize any potential for intellectual property leakage, regardless of the specific software's functionality. Option B. Assume that the software vendor's standard terms of service adequately address intellectual property protection and proceed with implementation if the general security features meet organizational standards. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment to identify all intellectual property assets that could be affected by the software and evaluate potential risks of unauthorized disclosure, infringement, or misuse. Option D. Rely on the legal department to review the software's compliance with intellectual property laws after the implementation is complete, focusing the CSS's efforts on technical security configurations only. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment to identify all intellectual property assets that could be affected by the software and evaluate potential risks of unauthorized disclosure, infringement, or misuse. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a certified security specialist, CSS, to navigate the complex intersection of intellectual property rights (IPR) and security protocols within a specific regulatory framework. The CSS must balance the need to protect proprietary information with the legal obligations and ethical considerations surrounding IPR. Misjudgments can lead to significant legal repercussions, financial penalties, and reputational damage for the organization. Careful judgment is required to ensure that security measures are both effective in preventing unauthorized access and use of intellectual property and compliant with all applicable laws and guidelines. The correct approach involves conducting a thorough impact assessment of the proposed new software on the organization's intellectual property. This assessment should identify all forms of intellectual property that could be affected, such as patents, copyrights, trade secrets, and trademarks. It then requires evaluating the potential risks of unauthorized disclosure, infringement, or misuse of this intellectual property due to the new software's functionalities, data handling capabilities, and access controls. Based on this evaluation, appropriate security controls and contractual clauses can be implemented to safeguard the IPR. This approach is professionally sound because it is proactive, risk-based, and directly addresses the potential IPR implications before deployment, aligning with the CSS's responsibility to protect organizational assets and ensure compliance. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the software implementation without any specific consideration for intellectual property rights, assuming existing general security measures are sufficient. This fails to acknowledge the unique legal protections afforded to intellectual property and the specific risks associated with its handling. It represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure by neglecting a critical asset class and potentially exposing the organization to IPR infringement claims or the loss of valuable proprietary information. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the software vendor's assurances regarding intellectual property protection without independent verification or due diligence. While vendor assurances are a starting point, they do not absolve the CSS or the organization of their responsibility to ensure compliance and adequate protection. This approach is ethically questionable and legally risky, as it outsources a critical security and compliance function without proper oversight, potentially leading to unforeseen vulnerabilities and breaches of IPR. A further incorrect approach would be to implement overly restrictive security measures that hinder legitimate business operations and innovation, without a clear understanding of the actual IPR risks. While security is paramount, it must be proportionate to the identified risks. Implementing excessive controls without a proper impact assessment can stifle productivity and create unnecessary friction, demonstrating a lack of nuanced understanding of both security needs and business objectives. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a clear understanding of the regulatory framework governing intellectual property rights relevant to the organization's jurisdiction. This involves identifying all relevant intellectual property assets. Subsequently, a risk assessment tailored to the specific technology or process being introduced should be conducted, focusing on potential IPR vulnerabilities. This assessment should inform the development and implementation of proportionate security controls and contractual safeguards. Continuous monitoring and periodic review of these measures are essential to adapt to evolving threats and legal landscapes. Question 6. The investigation demonstrates that the primary power supply for critical data center has experienced intermittent failures, and the backup generator's fuel levels have not been checked in over 6 months, potentially compromising its operational readiness. As a certified security specialist, CSS, what is the most appropriate immediate course of action to ensure compliance with the regulatory framework governing such critical infrastructure? Option A. Advise the IT department to temporarily reroute critical data to a secondary, less secure facility to mitigate immediate risks while a long-term solution is sought. Option B. Immediately initiate a comprehensive risk assessment of the power and backup system's current state, document all findings, and present a detailed remediation plan to management, prioritizing actions based on potential impact and regulatory requirements. Option C. Recommend a cost-effective replacement of the backup generator with a less powerful, but newer, model to reduce ongoing maintenance expenses. Option D. Instruct the facilities team to perform an immediate fuel check and top-up of the backup generator, deferring a full system assessment until the next scheduled maintenance cycle. The correct answer is B. Immediately initiate a comprehensive risk assessment of the power and backup system's current state, document all findings, and present a detailed remediation plan to management, prioritizing actions based on potential impact and regulatory requirements. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a security specialist to balance operational continuity with regulatory compliance and stakeholder interests, particularly when a critical infrastructure component like a power and backup system is found to be deficient. The specialist must not only identify the technical issue, but also understand its implications within the defined regulatory framework for the Certified Security Specialist, CSS, exam. The challenge lies in recommending a course of action that is both technically sound and legally defensible, ensuring that the organization remains compliant and that the security of its operations is not compromised. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the identified power and backup system deficiency against the specific requirements of the relevant regulatory framework for the CSS exam. This includes understanding any mandated uptime percentages, testing frequencies, and documentation standards for critical systems. The specialist must then communicate the findings and recommended remediation actions to the appropriate stakeholders, prioritizing actions based on risk and regulatory impact. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the identified deficiency within the established legal and operational context, ensuring that the organization takes proactive steps to rectify the issue in a manner that aligns with its obligations. This aligns with the CSS professional's duty to uphold security standards and comply with applicable regulations. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the deficiency as a minor issue without a proper risk assessment, or to implement a solution that does not meet the minimum standards set by the regulatory framework. For instance, simply relying on the existing, albeit deficient, backup system without a plan for immediate remediation or temporary mitigation would be a regulatory failure. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize cost savings over compliance, opting for a cheaper, less robust solution that does not guarantee the required level of resilience. This would be an ethical and regulatory failure, as it potentially exposes the organization to unacceptable risks and noncompliance. Furthermore, failing to document the deficiency and the proposed remediation plan would also be a significant oversight, hindering future audits and accountability. Professionals in similar situations should adopt a structured decision-making process. This involves 1. Clearly identifying the problem and its potential impact. 2. Consulting the relevant regulatory framework and internal policies to understand obligations and best practices. 3. Conducting a risk assessment to quantify the potential consequences of the deficiency. 4. Developing a range of potential solutions, evaluating each against technical feasibility, cost, and regulatory compliance. 5. Communicating findings and recommendations clearly and concisely to relevant stakeholders, including management and technical teams. 6. Implementing the chosen solution with proper oversight and documentation, followed by verification and ongoing monitoring. Question 7. The analysis reveals that a recent increase in public safety incidents in a designated zone necessitates a review of current security protocols to enhance effectiveness and efficiency. As a certified security specialist, CSS, which approach to process optimization would best align with regulatory requirements and professional ethics for improving public safety? Option A. Implementing a comprehensive, data-driven review of existing security measures, identifying specific areas for improvement through performance metrics, and proposing targeted, compliant enhancements with stakeholder consultation. Option B. Immediately deploying advanced surveillance technology across the entire zone, assuming that increased technological presence will inherently deter incidents. Option C. Expanding patrol routes and personnel deployment without a clear analysis of incident patterns or resource allocation efficiency. Option D. Prioritizing the adoption of a new, unproven security software solution that promises significant efficiency gains without extensive testing or integration planning. The correct answer is A. Implementing a comprehensive, data-driven review of existing security measures, identifying specific areas for improvement through performance metrics, and proposing targeted, compliant enhancements with stakeholder consultation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a certified security specialist, CSS, to balance the immediate need for enhanced public safety with the imperative to adhere to established regulatory frameworks and ethical guidelines governing security operations. The pressure to demonstrate rapid improvement in public safety metrics can lead to shortcuts or the adoption of unproven methodologies, which could have unintended consequences or violate compliance requirements. Careful judgment is crucial to ensure that any process optimization efforts are both effective and legally sound. The correct approach involves a systematic and data-driven review of existing security protocols, identifying bottlenecks or inefficiencies through objective metrics, and then implementing targeted improvements that are validated against established performance indicators and regulatory compliance standards. This method ensures that changes are not arbitrary, but are based on evidence of their necessity and effectiveness, while also respecting the legal and ethical boundaries of security operations. Specifically, this aligns with the CSS's responsibility to uphold public safety in a manner that is both efficient and compliant with relevant legislation and industry best practices, which often emphasize risk assessment, evidence-based decision-making, and continuous improvement within a defined legal and ethical framework. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on increasing surveillance coverage without a corresponding analysis of its effectiveness or potential privacy implications would be professionally unacceptable. This fails to demonstrate a commitment to process optimization based on data and could lead to resource misallocation and potential violations of privacy regulations, which are often implicitly or explicitly part of public safety frameworks. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes the adoption of the latest technological solutions without a thorough assessment of their integration feasibility, operational impact, and alignment with existing security objectives would also be flawed. This demonstrates a lack of strategic thinking and could result in costly, ineffective deployments that do not genuinely enhance public safety or optimize existing processes. Finally, an approach that bypasses established consultation processes with relevant stakeholders, such as law enforcement or community representatives, to expedite changes would be ethically problematic. This neglects the collaborative nature of public safety initiatives and can undermine trust and operational effectiveness. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the problem or inefficiency identified. This should be followed by a comprehensive review of available data and relevant regulatory requirements. Potential solutions should then be evaluated not only for their technical feasibility and cost-effectiveness, but also for their compliance with legal mandates and ethical considerations. Pilot testing and phased implementation, coupled with continuous monitoring and evaluation, are essential to ensure that optimized processes deliver the desired outcomes without compromising safety, security, or legal standing. Question 8. The control framework reveals a significant physical security vulnerability at a primary data center entrance, specifically a compromised access control reader that has been intermittently failing. The security specialist is tasked with recommending the immediate course of action, which approach best aligns with the principles of a comprehensive security impact assessment. Option A. Recommend disabling the compromised reader and rerouting all personnel through a less secure, but fully operational, secondary entrance to maintain immediate operational flow. Option B. Immediately replace the access control reader with the most advanced model available, regardless of cost, to ensure maximum security. Option C. Conduct a thorough impact assessment to determine the criticality of the data center, the potential consequences of unauthorized access, and the likelihood of exploitation before proposing a remediation plan. Option D. Prioritize the replacement of the access control reader with a standard, cost-effective model to minimize disruption and expense, as the issue has not yet led to a confirmed breach. The correct answer is B. Immediately replace the access control reader with the most advanced model available, regardless of cost, to ensure maximum security. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a security specialist to balance the immediate need for operational continuity with the long-term implications of a physical security vulnerability. A hasty or incomplete impact assessment can lead to misallocation of resources, inadequate mitigation strategies, and potential future breaches. The specialist must demonstrate a thorough understanding of the potential consequences of the identified vulnerability, not just its immediate presence. The correct approach involves a systematic and comprehensive evaluation of the potential impact of the identified physical security vulnerability on the organization's assets, operations, and reputation. This includes identifying what critical assets are exposed, the potential consequences of unauthorized access or compromise, e.g., data theft, operational disruption, reputational damage, and the likelihood of such an event occurring. This methodical process aligns with the principles of risk management mandated by regulatory frameworks that require organizations to identify, assess, and treat risks to their information and physical assets. For a certified security specialist, CSS, this directly relates to the core competencies of understanding and applying security controls and their effectiveness. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the cost of immediate remediation without considering the potential impact is professionally unacceptable. This fails to adhere to the fundamental principle of risk management, which prioritizes mitigation efforts based on the severity of potential consequences. Such an approach could lead to under-resourcing critical areas or overinvesting in less significant vulnerabilities, demonstrating a lack of strategic security thinking. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes the convenience of operational staff over the security implications of the vulnerability is also professionally flawed. Security controls are often designed to create friction, to prevent unauthorized access. Ignoring or downplaying a vulnerability because it inconveniences staff demonstrates a failure to uphold the primary duty of protecting organizational assets and information. This can lead to significant security incidents and breaches, as well as potential regulatory noncompliance if the vulnerability leads to a breach of sensitive data or critical infrastructure. A professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a structured risk assessment methodology. This begins with identifying the asset or system at risk, then assessing the threats and vulnerabilities. Following this, the potential impact of a successful threat exploiting a vulnerability must be thoroughly analyzed. This impact analysis should consider financial, operational, reputational, and legal/regulatory consequences. Based on this comprehensive understanding of risk, appropriate mitigation strategies can be developed and prioritized. The Certified Security Specialist, CSS, must be able to articulate the rationale behind their recommendations, linking them directly to the assessed risks and potential impacts, thereby justifying the proposed security measures to stakeholders. Question 9. To address the challenge of ensuring robust protection of sensitive data and critical systems within the specified regulatory framework for the Certified Security Specialist, CSS, exam, which risk assessment approach best aligns with the principles of the CIA triad and regulatory compliance? Option A. Rely on historical incident data and expert opinions to identify potential security weaknesses without a formal, structured assessment of all CIA triad components. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment that systematically identifies threats and vulnerabilities, analyzes their potential impact on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and prioritizes mitigation efforts based on risk levels. Option C. Implement stringent access controls and encryption mechanisms to ensure the confidentiality of all data. Assuming this is the primary concern for regulatory compliance. Option D. Focus on deploying advanced intrusion detection systems and firewalls to prevent unauthorized access, as this directly addresses the integrity and availability of network infrastructure. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment that systematically identifies threats and vulnerabilities, analyzes their potential impact on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and prioritizes mitigation efforts based on risk levels. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a security specialist to balance competing priorities within the CIA triad while adhering to specific regulatory requirements. The challenge lies in identifying the most effective risk assessment approach that not only addresses potential threats to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, but also aligns with the stringent guidelines of the Certified Security Specialist, CSS, exam-specified jurisdiction. A deep understanding of the regulatory framework is paramount to ensure that the chosen approach is compliant and ethically sound, preventing potential breaches and legal repercussions. The correct approach involves a comprehensive risk assessment that prioritizes threats based on their potential impact and likelihood, directly linking these risks to the CIA triad. This method ensures that security controls are implemented strategically, focusing resources on the most critical vulnerabilities. Regulatory justification for this approach stems from the implicit requirement within most security frameworks, including those relevant to CSS certification, to conduct thorough risk assessments as a foundational element of a robust security program. Ethical considerations dictate a proactive stance in identifying and mitigating risks to protect sensitive information and maintain operational continuity. An approach that focuses solely on confidentiality without adequately considering integrity or availability would be ethically and regulatorily deficient. Confidentiality is only one facet of information security. Neglecting integrity could lead to unauthorized modifications of data, and overlooking availability could result in service disruptions, both of which have significant consequences and are typically addressed by regulatory mandates. An approach that prioritizes technical solutions over understanding the underlying business processes and their associated risks is also flawed. While technical controls are vital, they must be informed by a thorough understanding of how business operations rely on the CIA triad. Without this context, technical solutions may be misapplied, ineffective, or even introduce new vulnerabilities, failing to meet regulatory expectations for a holistic security posture. Furthermore, an approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or past incidents without a structured, forward-looking risk assessment process is professionally unsound. Regulatory frameworks often mandate systematic risk identification and evaluation. Relying on past events alone can lead to a reactive rather than proactive security posture, failing to anticipate emerging threats and vulnerabilities. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the specific regulatory and legal obligations of the jurisdiction. 2. Identifying all assets and their criticality to the organization. 3. Analyzing potential threats and vulnerabilities to each asset. 4. Assessing the impact of these threats on confidentiality, integrity, and availability. 5. Prioritizing risks based on likelihood and impact. 6. Selecting and implementing appropriate security controls that address the prioritized risks and comply with regulations. 7. Regularly reviewing and updating the risk assessment and control measures. Question 10. The review process indicates that the organization's current security posture is being assessed for the implementation of a defense-in-depth strategy. Given the available resources and the need to address potential threats effectively, which of the following approaches to integrating risk assessment with defense-in-depth is most professionally sound and compliant with general security best practices? Option A. Implement all available security controls that are deemed cost-effective, regardless of their direct impact on identified risks, to create a broad but potentially unfocused security layer. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to identify and prioritize critical vulnerabilities, then design and implement defense-in-depth controls specifically to address these prioritized risks. Option C. Defer the implementation of any defense-in-depth controls until a complete and exhaustive risk assessment, covering every conceivable threat, has been finalized. Option D. Focus on acquiring the most advanced and expensive security technologies first, assuming they will provide the strongest defense, and then conduct a risk assessment to justify their deployment. Correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to identify and prioritize critical vulnerabilities, then design and implement defense-in-depth controls specifically to address these prioritized risks. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the implementation of a defense-in-depth strategy with the practical constraints of a risk assessment. A defense-in-depth approach, by its nature, involves multiple layers of security controls. The challenge lies in prioritizing these controls effectively within the scope of a risk assessment, ensuring that the most critical vulnerabilities are addressed first without becoming overwhelmed by the sheer number of potential controls. Careful judgment is required to align security investments with identified risks and regulatory requirements. The correct approach involves systematically identifying, analyzing, and prioritizing risks to determine the most effective security controls to implement as part of a defense-in-depth strategy. This aligns with the principles of a robust risk assessment, which is a foundational element of many security frameworks. By focusing on the highest priority risks, organizations can ensure that their defense-in-depth strategy is both comprehensive and efficient, addressing the most significant threats first. This approach is ethically sound as it demonstrates due diligence in protecting assets and complying with regulatory obligations by proactively managing identified risks. It also aligns with the spirit of regulatory frameworks that mandate risk-based security measures. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on implementing every possible security control without a prior risk assessment is professionally unacceptable. This leads to inefficient resource allocation and a failure to prioritize effectively. It can result in significant expenditure on controls that offer minimal risk reduction for the investment, while critical vulnerabilities may remain unaddressed. This approach fails to meet the ethical obligation of responsible resource management and can be seen as a failure to conduct a proper risk assessment, as often mandated by regulatory guidelines. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes controls based on cost alone, without considering their effectiveness in mitigating identified risks, is also professionally unsound. While cost is a factor, it should not be the sole determinant. This can lead to the adoption of inexpensive but ineffective controls, leaving the organization exposed to significant threats. This demonstrates a lack of professional judgment and a failure to adhere to the principles of risk management, potentially violating regulatory requirements that emphasize effective risk mitigation. Finally, an approach that delays the implementation of any security controls until a perfect, exhaustive risk assessment is completed is also problematic. This can lead to prolonged periods of vulnerability, exposing the organization to immediate threats. While thoroughness is important, a pragmatic approach that allows for iterative risk assessment and control implementation is often more effective in maintaining a strong security posture. This delay can be interpreted as a failure to act with reasonable diligence in protecting information assets, which can have regulatory and ethical repercussions. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment methodology. This includes identifying assets, threats, vulnerabilities, and potential impacts. Based on this analysis, risks should be prioritized. The defense-in-depth strategy should then be designed to address these prioritized risks with a layered approach, selecting controls that offer the most effective mitigation for the identified threats. Regular review and updates to the risk assessment and the defense-in-depth strategy are crucial to adapt to evolving threat landscapes and business needs. Question 11. What factors determine the appropriate application of the need-to-know principle when granting access to sensitive information within an organization? Option A. A broad request for all information deemed relevant to the individual's department or team. Option B. The general job title of the requesting individual and their position within the organizational hierarchy. Option C. The seniority of the requesting individual and their perceived importance to the organization. Option D. The individual's specific job responsibilities and the direct relevance of the requested information to their assigned tasks. The correct answer is D. The individual's specific job responsibilities and the direct relevance of the requested information to their assigned tasks. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a security specialist to balance the legitimate need for information access with the imperative to protect sensitive data from unauthorized disclosure. The need-to-know principle is a cornerstone of information security, but its application can be subjective and prone to overreach or underestimation. A security specialist must exercise sound judgment to ensure that access is granted only to those who demonstrably require it for their job functions, without unduly hindering operational efficiency or creating unnecessary barriers. Failure to correctly apply this principle can lead to data breaches, compliance violations, or operational paralysis. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic evaluation of an individual's role, responsibilities, and the specific tasks they are assigned. This evaluation must be directly tied to the information requested and the potential impact of that information being compromised. The justification for granting access should be documented and based on a clear, demonstrable link between the information and the individual's job function. This aligns with best practices in information security and regulatory frameworks that mandate data protection and access control based on legitimate business needs. For instance, in many jurisdictions, data protection regulations, such as GDPR if this were a UK exam, or similar principles under US frameworks like NIST, require organizations to implement technical and organizational measures to ensure that personal data is processed lawfully, fairly, and transparently, and that access is limited to what is necessary for the purposes for which the data are processed. The need-to-know principle is a practical implementation of this requirement. Incorrect approaches analysis. Granting access based solely on an individual's job title, without a granular understanding of their specific duties and the information sensitivity, is an incorrect approach. This can lead to over-provisioning of access, increasing the risk of unauthorized disclosure or misuse. It fails to adhere to the principle of least privilege, a fundamental security concept. Granting access based on the seniority of the requesting individual, irrespective of their actual job requirements, is also incorrect. Seniority does not inherently equate to a need for access to all information within a certain domain. This approach can lead to unnecessary access for individuals who may not actively use the information, thereby increasing the attack surface and potential for accidental or intentional breaches. Granting access based on a general request for all relevant information, without requiring the requester to specify the exact data elements needed and the justification for each, is fundamentally flawed. This broad approach bypasses the core of the need-to-know principle, which necessitates a precise understanding of what information is required and why. It creates a high risk of overaccess and is a direct contravention of best practices for granular access control. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based, granular approach to access control. This involves 1. Clearly defining data classifications and sensitivity levels. 2. Establishing a formal access request and approval process. 3. Requiring requesters to articulate specific information needs and the business justification for each. 4. Verifying the necessity of access against an individual's defined role and responsibilities. 5. Implementing regular reviews of access privileges. 6. Documenting all access decisions and justifications. This systematic process ensures that access is granted judiciously, minimizing risk while enabling legitimate business operation. Question 12. Market research demonstrates that insider threats continue to pose a significant risk to organizational data integrity and confidentiality. As a certified security specialist, CSS, you are tasked with developing a strategy to enhance insider threat awareness and mitigation. Which of the following approaches best aligns with a proactive, risk-based, and compliant security posture? Option A. Implement a comprehensive risk assessment to identify potential insider threat vectors, analyze their likelihood and impact, and develop targeted mitigation strategies. Option B. Deploy extensive technical surveillance tools across all employee workstations to monitor all digital activities for suspicious behavior. Option C. Prioritize immediate disciplinary action against any employee exhibiting behavior that deviates from standard operating procedures, regardless of intent or impact. Option D. Establish a reporting system where employees can anonymously report any perceived suspicious activity based on personal observations or rumors. The correct answer is A. Implement a comprehensive risk assessment to identify potential insider threat vectors, analyze their likelihood and impact, and develop targeted mitigation strategies. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the imperative to protect sensitive company data from insider threats with the need to maintain employee trust and avoid creating a climate of suspicion. A robust insider threat program must be proactive and risk-based, not reactive or overly punitive. The Certified Security Specialist, CSS, must apply a framework that is both effective in mitigating risks and compliant with relevant regulations and ethical standards. The correct approach involves a comprehensive risk assessment that identifies potential insider threats, analyzes their likelihood and impact, and prioritizes mitigation strategies. This aligns with best practices in information security and risk management, which are implicitly or explicitly supported by regulatory frameworks that mandate a risk-based approach to security. For example, regulations often require organizations to identify and assess risks to sensitive data and implement appropriate controls. A risk assessment allows for the allocation of resources to address the most significant threats, ensuring that security measures are proportionate to the identified risks. This approach is proactive, data-driven, and focused on achieving security objectives efficiently. An approach that focuses solely on technical surveillance without a preceding risk assessment is flawed because it may lead to over-monitoring, privacy violations, and a breakdown in employee morale, without necessarily targeting the most critical risks. This can also be seen as a failure to implement controls in a proportionate and risk-based manner, which is a common requirement in many regulatory regimes. An approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or rumors to trigger investigations is professionally unsound and ethically problematic. Lacks objectivity, can lead to unfair accusations, and fails to establish a systematic process for identifying and addressing insider threats. This approach bypasses the due diligence required to establish probable cause for intrusive monitoring or disciplinary action, potentially violating principles of fairness and due process. An approach that prioritizes immediate disciplinary action upon any suspicion, without thorough investigation or risk assessment, is also incorrect. This reactive stance can lead to wrongful accusations, damage the organization's reputation, and fail to address the root causes of insider threats. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of the nuances of insider threat management, which often involves a spectrum of behaviors and motivations, not all of which are malicious or require immediate punitive measures. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the organization's specific threat landscape and assets. This involves conducting a thorough risk assessment to identify vulnerabilities and potential insider threat scenarios. Based on this assessment, a layered security strategy should be developed, incorporating technical controls, policy enforcement, and employee awareness training. Investigations should be triggered by objective indicators and conducted with due process, ensuring that actions taken are proportionate to the identified risks and in compliance with all applicable laws and ethical guidelines. Question 13. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of unusually large outbound data transfers to an unknown external IP address, coupled with a series of failed login attempts from an internal workstation that is not typically used for remote access. Based on the Certified Security Specialist (CSS) framework, what is the most appropriate immediate action for a CSS to take? Option A. Immediately isolate the internal workstation from the network and block the external IP address to prevent further data exfiltration. Option B. Analyze the content of the data transfers to determine if sensitive information is being exfiltrated. Option C. Contact the user of the internal workstation to inquire about their recent activity. Option D. Document the observed anomalies, verify the external IP address against known threat intelligence, and initiate the organization's formal incident response procedure by notifying the designated incident response team. The correct answer is A. Immediately isolate the internal workstation from the network and block the external IP address to prevent further data exfiltration. Explanation: the monitoring system demonstrates a series of anomalous network activities, including unusual data packet sizes and unexpected connection attempts to external IP addresses outside of the organization's approved vendor list. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires immediate interpretation of technical indicators within a specific regulatory context to determine the appropriate response. The CSS must balance the need for rapid incident response with the requirement to adhere to established protocols and legal obligations, ensuring that actions taken are both effective in mitigating potential threats and compliant with relevant frameworks. Misinterpreting these indicators or acting without proper authorization could lead to significant security breaches, regulatory penalties, or reputational damage. The correct approach involves accurately identifying the observed activities as potential indicators of compromise (EOCS) and initiating the organization's established incident response plan. This plan, guided by the Certified Security Specialist (CSS) framework, mandates the immediate escalation of such findings to the designated incident response team for further investigation and analysis. This process ensures that all actions are coordinated, documented, and aligned with the organization's security policies and any applicable regulatory requirements for data breach notification or incident reporting. The CSS's role is to be the initial point of detection and reporting, not to independently diagnose or remediate complex security incidents without following the defined procedures. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the anomalous activities as benign network noise without proper investigation. This failure to recognize potential EOCS violates the fundamental principle of proactive security monitoring and risk assessment, which is a cornerstone of the CSS role. It also bypasses the mandated incident response procedures, potentially allowing a security incident to escalate undetected. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to directly block the external IP addresses or modify network configurations without authorization or a thorough understanding of the potential impact. This unauthorized action could disrupt legitimate business operations, interfere with ongoing investigations, or even inadvertently alert an attacker to the monitoring efforts, thereby compromising the integrity of the incident response. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to share the raw monitoring data with unauthorized personnel or external parties without following the organization's data handling and disclosure policies. This could lead to a breach of confidentiality and violate privacy regulations. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic approach. First, recognize and document all observed anomalies. Second, cross-reference these anomalies against known threat intelligence and organizational baseline activity. Third, immediately consult and follow the organization's incident response plan, escalating findings to the appropriate teams. Fourth, ensure all actions are logged and communicated through official channels. This structured process ensures that technical observations are translated into compliant and effective security actions. Question 14. Compliance review shows that a critical system, governed by the Bell-LaPadula model, requires a developer to analyze a dataset containing highly sensitive information. The developer, operating at a lower security clearance, needs to extract specific data points for debugging purposes. The system administrator is under pressure to expedite the developer's access to facilitate a timely system fix. What is the most appropriate course of action for the system administrator to ensure compliance with the Bell-LaPadula model and CSS professional standards? Option A. Instruct the developer to manually extract only the non-sensitive portions of the data, assuming they can accurately distinguish between sensitive and non-sensitive elements. Option B. Grant the developer direct read access to the entire dataset, trusting them to only extract the necessary information. Option C. Deny the developer access to the sensitive data and inform them that a formal process for data sanitization and controlled access must be followed, even if it delays the system fix. Option D. Allow the developer to copy the entire dataset to a less secure staging environment for their analysis. The correct answer is B. Grant the developer direct read access to the entire dataset, trusting them to only extract the necessary information. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the operational needs of a critical system with the strict security principles mandated by the Bell-LaPadula model, as interpreted within the Certified Security Specialist (CSS) regulatory framework. The dilemma arises from a perceived need to bypass established security protocols for a perceived immediate benefit, which directly conflicts with the core tenets of preventing information flow from higher security levels to lower ones. Careful judgment is required to uphold security integrity without unduly hindering legitimate operations. The correct approach involves adhering strictly to the Bell-LaPadula model's no read-up and no write-down rules, even when faced with pressure to expedite a process. This means that the system administrator must ensure that any data being accessed or modified by a user with a lower security clearance does not originate from a higher security clearance, and that any data being written is not being written to a lower security level. This aligns with the fundamental principle of the Bell-LaPadula model, which is to protect confidentiality by preventing unauthorized disclosure of information. The CSS framework emphasizes adherence to established security models and protocols as a cornerstone of professional responsibility. An incorrect approach would be to grant the developer direct access to the sensitive data, bypassing the established clearance levels. This directly violates the no read-up rule of the Bell-LaPadula model, as the developer, operating at a lower clearance level, would be able to read information from a higher security classification. This failure to uphold confidentiality is a direct breach of security principles and the CSS Professional Code of Conduct. Another incorrect approach would be to allow the developer to copy the sensitive data to a less secure environment for analysis. This violates the no write-down rule, as information classified at a higher security level is being transferred to a lower security level, thereby increasing the risk of unauthorized disclosure. This action undermines the integrity of the security classification system. A third incorrect approach would be to instruct the developer to manually extract only the non-sensitive portions of the data. While seemingly a compromise, this still carries significant risk. Without a formal, audited process for data sanitization and verification, there is a high probability of accidental disclosure of sensitive information, or the introduction of subtle but critical data points that could be inferred by the developer. This approach lacks the rigor and auditable controls required by the Bell-LaPadula model and the CSS framework. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the applicable security model, in this case, Bell-LaPadula, and its implications for information flow. When faced with a request that appears to conflict with these principles, the professional should 1. Identify the specific security rules being challenged. 2. Assess the potential risks of noncompliance. 3. Consult relevant policies and procedures. 4. Seek guidance from senior security personnel or legal counsel if ambiguity exists. 5. Prioritize adherence to established security protocols over expediency, ensuring that any exceptions are formally documented, justified, and approved through a defined process, and that the integrity of the security model is maintained. Question 15. System analysis indicates that the accounts payable department currently allows the same employee to create new vendor records and subsequently approve payments to those vendors. To optimize process efficiency while maintaining robust security, Which of the following adjustments would best align with the principle of separation of duties and regulatory expectations for internal controls? Option A. Establish a policy requiring a separate employee, distinct from the one who creates vendor records, to be responsible for approving all payments to those vendors. Option B. Consolidate the roles of vendor creation and payment approval under a single, highly trusted senior accountant to streamline the process and reduce oversight requirements. Option C. Implement a workflow where the employee who creates a new vendor record is automatically assigned as the approver for the first 3 payments to that vendor, with subsequent approvals handled by a different designated employee. Option D. Allow the employee who creates vendor records to also approve payments, but require them to document a detailed justification for each payment, which is then filed without independent review. Correct answer is C. Implement a workflow where the employee who creates a new vendor record is automatically assigned as the approver for the first 3 payments to that vendor, with subsequent approvals handled by a different designated employee. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing operational efficiency with robust security controls, specifically concerning the principle of separation of duties. The challenge lies in identifying a solution that minimizes risk without unduly hindering critical business processes. Careful judgment is required to ensure that no single individual has the authority to complete a transaction or process from initiation to finalization, thereby preventing fraud, errors, and unauthorized actions. The correct approach involves implementing a system where the individual responsible for initiating a financial transaction, e.g., creating a payment request, is distinct from the individual authorized to approve and execute that transaction. This segregation of duties is a fundamental control mechanism mandated by various regulatory frameworks governing financial institutions and data security. Specifically, within the context of a Certified Security Specialist (CSS) exam, this aligns with best practices and often implied or explicit requirements found in regulations like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act (SOX) in the U.S., which emphasizes internal controls over financial reporting, and similar principles in UK financial regulations that focus on operational resilience and risk management. The ethical imperative is to protect the organization and its stakeholders from financial loss and reputational damage. An incorrect approach would be to allow the same individual to both initiate and approve payment requests. This creates a significant control weakness, as it provides an opportunity for an individual to perpetrate fraud or make errors without detection. This directly violates the principle of separation of duties, increasing the risk of unauthorized transactions and financial misstatement, which would be a failure to adhere to regulatory expectations for internal controls. Another incorrect approach would be to delegate the initiation and approval of all payment requests to a single senior manager, without any independent verification or review. While this might seem efficient, it concentrates too much power and responsibility in one person, bypassing the intended segregation of duties. This approach fails to establish the necessary checks and balances, leaving the organization vulnerable to the same risks as the first incorrect approach, and potentially even exacerbating them if the senior manager is compromised or makes a significant error. A third incorrect approach would be to implement a system where multiple individuals can initiate a request, but only one of those initiators can also approve it. This still fails to achieve true separation of duties, as it allows an individual to have a role in both the initiation and the final approval stages, albeit indirectly. The core principle is that the person who creates the request should not be the same person who authorizes its execution. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a thorough risk assessment of the process in question. Identify all critical steps within the process and the individuals or roles involved. Then, map these steps to the principle of separation of duties. Determine if any single individual or role has control over multiple critical, sequential steps that could lead to a security breach or financial impropriety. Consult relevant regulatory requirements and industry best practices to understand the mandated or recommended control frameworks. Design controls that segregate these critical functions, ensuring that no single point of failure exists. Regularly review and audit these controls to ensure their continued effectiveness. Question 16. System analysis indicates a potential unauthorized access to a customer database containing personal identifiable information, PI. The security team has confirmed a suspected data exfiltration event, but the full scope and impact are still under investigation. According to the Certified Security Specialist, CSS, exam's jurisdiction, which of the following incident reporting procedures best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional best practices? Option A. Immediately initiate the formal incident response plan, escalate to the designated internal security lead, and prepare to submit a preliminary report to the Information Commissioner's Office, ICO, within the legally mandated timeframe, while continuing the investigation to gather more details. Option B. Report the incident solely to senior management and await their directive on whether and how to proceed with external notifications. Option C. Provide a high-level summary of the suspected breach to the ICO without detailing the PII involved, as the full extent is not yet known. Option D. Continue the full investigation to determine the exact number of affected individuals and the precise nature of the exfiltrated data before initiating any external reporting to regulatory bodies. The correct answer is A. Immediately initiate the formal incident response plan, escalate to the designated internal security lead, and prepare to submit a preliminary report to the Information Commissioner's Office, ICO, within the legally mandated timeframe, while continuing the investigation to gather more details. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the critical nature of incident reporting in maintaining regulatory compliance and organizational security. The Certified Security Specialist, CSS, must navigate the immediate aftermath of a potential data breach, balancing the need for swift action with the requirement for accurate and timely reporting according to established protocols. The challenge lies in discerning the appropriate level of detail and the correct reporting channels under pressure, where missteps could lead to regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and further security vulnerabilities. The correct approach involves a systematic and compliant reporting process. This entails immediately escalating the incident to the designated internal security team and initiating the formal incident response plan. Crucially, this includes adhering to the specific reporting timelines and content requirements mandated by relevant regulatory bodies, such as the Information Commissioner's Office, ICO. In the UK, if personal data is involved, the justification for this approach is rooted in the Data Protection Act 2018 and the UK GDPR, which impose strict obligations on data controllers and processors to report personal data breaches to the ICO without undue delay, and where feasible, not later than 72 hours after becoming aware of it. Failure to do so can result in significant fines. This approach prioritizes transparency, accountability, and adherence to legal obligations. An incorrect approach would be to delay reporting, while attempting to fully investigate and contain the incident without any initial notification. This failure stems from a misunderstanding of the regulatory imperative for prompt reporting. The law does not permit indefinite delays for complete resolution before reporting. The obligation is to report once awareness of a breach occurs, with ongoing investigation and mitigation efforts. Another incorrect approach would be to report only to internal management without engaging the relevant external regulatory authority. This overlooks the direct legal obligation to inform the ICO, treating the incident as purely an internal matter rather than a breach with legal reporting consequences. A third incorrect approach would be to provide incomplete or misleading information in the initial report. This undermines the integrity of the reporting process and can lead to further scrutiny and penalties, as regulatory bodies rely on accurate information to assess the severity and impact of the breach. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a clear understanding of the incident response plan and the applicable regulatory framework. The CSS should first identify the nature of the incident and assess if it constitutes a reportable breach under relevant laws. If so, the immediate priority is to trigger the internal reporting mechanism and initiate the external reporting process within the stipulated timeframe, providing all known details accurately. This proactive and compliant stance ensures that regulatory obligations are met, minimizing potential legal and financial repercussions. Question 17. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a new commercial building project requires enhanced physical security measures to protect sensitive data storage areas. The construction phase is underway, and the project manager is proposing to substitute a less expensive, but seemingly similar, type of reinforced door and frame for the specified high-security model to stay within budget. As a certified security specialist, CSS, which approach should you recommend? Option A. Recommend proceeding with the less expensive door and frame, provided a detailed justification is documented for the deviation. Option B. Recommend a thorough review of the proposed substitute door and frame against the original security specifications and relevant building codes to ensure it meets or exceeds all security performance requirements and regulatory mandates. Option C. Recommend accepting the substitution to maintain project timelines and budget, assuming the visual appearance is similar and the risk of a breach is low. Option D. Recommend deferring the decision on the door and frame until after construction is complete to assess the remaining budget and explore potential retrofitting options. The correct answer is A. Recommend proceeding with the less expensive door and frame, provided a detailed justification is documented for the deviation. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing immediate cost-saving pressures with long-term security and compliance obligations. The Certified Security Specialist, CSS, must navigate potential conflicts between project timelines, budget constraints, and the imperative to adhere to established building design and construction regulations. Careful judgment is required to ensure that security measures are not compromised for expediency or financial reasons, as this could lead to significant vulnerabilities and regulatory noncompliance. Correct approach involves prioritizing the integration of security design principles from the earliest stages of construction, ensuring that all proposed security features and construction methods align with the relevant regulatory framework for building design and construction. This proactive integration is crucial for establishing a robust security posture that is both effective and compliant. Specifically, this approach aligns with the principles of security by design, which is often implicitly or explicitly mandated by building codes and security standards that aim to prevent unauthorized access, mitigate risks of damage or theft, and ensure the safety of occupants. Adherence to these regulations is not merely a procedural step, but a fundamental ethical and legal responsibility of a CSS. An incorrect approach that prioritizes cost reduction by omitting or downgrading specified security features would represent a significant regulatory failure. Such an approach directly contravenes building codes and security standards that mandate specific levels of physical security for certain types of facilities or assets. Ethically, it demonstrates a disregard for the safety and security of the building's occupants and assets, potentially exposing the organization to liability. Another incorrect approach that relies on retrofitting security measures after construction is completed is also problematic. While sometimes necessary, it often leads to less effective and more costly security solutions compared to integrated design. This approach can fail to meet the performance requirements stipulated by regulations, as retrofitting may not achieve the same level of structural integrity or seamless integration as planned design, thereby creating security gaps and potential noncompliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the applicable regulatory framework for building design and construction. This involves identifying all relevant codes, standards, and guidelines. Subsequently, a risk assessment should be conducted to identify potential threats and vulnerabilities specific to the building's purpose and location. The next step is to develop security design options that directly address these risks and comply with regulations. When faced with cost pressures, the framework dictates evaluating the long-term implications of any proposed changes, including potential security compromises, increased future costs for remediation, and regulatory penalties. The decision should always favor approaches that maintain or enhance security and regulatory compliance, even if it requires advocating for budget adjustments or alternative compliance solutions. Question 18. The evaluation methodology shows that a facility storing significant quantities of flammable liquids and corrosive chemicals has a security plan that focuses primarily on perimeter intrusion detection and access control to general storage areas. However, it lacks specific protocols for the secure storage and emergency response related to these hazardous materials, and does not explicitly reference compliance with relevant environmental protection regulations concerning their containment and handling. Which of the following approaches best addresses the identified deficiencies in environmental security? Option A. Enhance the perimeter security and access control systems to prevent any unauthorized entry into the facility, assuming this will inherently protect the hazardous materials. Option B. Conduct a general risk assessment of all facility assets and implement security measures based on their monetary value, without specific consideration for the environmental hazards they pose. Option C. Rely on the existing environmental permits and licenses to ensure compliance, and focus security efforts on preventing theft of finished goods rather than the raw hazardous materials. Option D. Update the security plan to include detailed procedures for the secure storage, handling, and emergency response for all hazardous materials, ensuring these procedures align with applicable environmental protection laws and guidelines for containment, spill prevention, and waste disposal. The correct answer is D. Update the security plan to include detailed procedures for the secure storage, handling, and emergency response for all hazardous materials, ensuring these procedures align with applicable environmental protection laws and guidelines for containment, spill prevention, and waste disposal. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a certified security specialist, CSS, to navigate the complex interplay between physical security measures and environmental regulations, specifically concerning hazardous materials. The CSS must ensure that security protocols not only prevent unauthorized access and theft, but also comply with stringent environmental laws designed to protect public health and the ecosystem. Failure to do so can result in severe legal penalties, reputational damage, and environmental harm. Careful judgment is required to balance security objectives with regulatory obligations, ensuring that security measures do not inadvertently create environmental risks or violate compliance requirements. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the facility's hazardous material inventory and the existing security plan to identify any potential conflicts or gaps in compliance. This includes verifying that storage, handling, and disposal procedures for hazardous materials are aligned with relevant environmental regulations, such as those pertaining to the storage of flammable liquids or toxic substances. The CSS must then propose and implement security enhancements that also satisfy these environmental mandates, such as ensuring secondary containment for hazardous materials, implementing access controls to restricted areas where these materials are stored, and establishing protocols for emergency response that consider environmental protection. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the regulatory framework governing environmental security, ensuring that the facility operates in compliance with all applicable laws and guidelines, thereby mitigating both security and environmental risks. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on traditional physical security threats, such as intrusion detection and access control, without considering the specific environmental risks associated with the hazardous materials present. This failure to integrate environmental compliance into the security plan would violate regulatory requirements designed to prevent environmental contamination and protect public safety. Another incorrect approach would be to implement security measures that inadvertently exacerbate environmental risks. For example, by placing emergency response equipment in a location that could be compromised by a hazardous material spill, or by not having adequate protocols for securing hazardous waste disposal sites. Such actions would demonstrate a lack of understanding of the interconnectedness of security and environmental protection, leading to non-compliance and potential harm. A third incorrect approach would be to assume that existing environmental permits automatically cover all security-related aspects of hazardous material management, neglecting the need for specific security protocols to prevent unauthorized access, tampering, or diversion of these materials, which could lead to environmental incidents. Professionals should adopt a risk-based decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive assessment of all potential threats, including both security and environmental risks. This assessment should be informed by a thorough understanding of the specific regulatory landscape applicable to the facility's operations and the materials it handles. The next step involves identifying control measures that address these risks holistically, prioritizing those that offer dual benefits in terms of security and environmental protection. Regular review and updates of security plans in light of evolving regulations and operational changes are crucial. Collaboration with environmental compliance officers and legal counsel is essential to ensure that all security measures are fully compliant with relevant laws and ethical standards. Question 19. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a comprehensive, multi-layered security system for the entire facility would be prohibitively expensive, exceeding the allocated budget by 40%. However, a targeted approach focusing on the most critical assets and high-risk areas, while still within budget, would significantly reduce the likelihood of a major breach. Given these findings, what is the most appropriate course of action for a certified security specialist, CSS, to recommend? Option A. Recommend implementing the cheapest available security solutions across the entire facility to maximize coverage, regardless of specific risk levels. Option B. Recommend prioritizing visible security deterrents such as increased guard presence over less visible but potentially more effective technological solutions. Option C. Recommend deferring all security upgrades until the full budget for the comprehensive system can be secured. Option D. Recommend the implementation of the targeted, budget-compliant security measures that address the highest identified risks. The correct answer is D. Recommend the implementation of the targeted, budget-compliant security measures that address the highest identified risks. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in facility security, balancing the need for robust physical security measures with budgetary constraints. The professional challenge lies in identifying security solutions that are not only effective, but also justifiable from a cost-benefit perspective, while strictly adhering to the regulatory framework governing the Certified Security Specialist, CSS, designation. This requires a nuanced understanding of risk assessment, threat mitigation, and the specific legal and ethical obligations of a security professional. The pressure to reduce costs can lead to the temptation to implement superficial or inadequate measures, which could have severe consequences if a security incident occurs. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive risk assessment to identify critical assets and potential threats, followed by the selection of layered security controls that offer the most effective mitigation for the identified risks within the allocated budget. This approach prioritizes the implementation of measures that directly address the highest probability and impact threats. For example, if the risk assessment indicates a high likelihood of unauthorized access to sensitive data storage areas, investing in access control systems and surveillance for those specific locations would be prioritized over more general, less targeted security enhancements. This aligns with the CSS professional's duty to implement security measures that are proportionate to the risks faced by the facility, as often stipulated in general security best practices and implied by the ethical obligation to protect assets and personnel. While specific CSS regulations might not detail every security control, the overarching principles of due diligence and risk management are fundamental. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing security measures solely based on the lowest upfront cost without a thorough risk assessment is an incorrect approach. This often leads to a false sense of security, as the most critical vulnerabilities may remain unaddressed. Such an approach fails to meet the professional obligation to provide effective security and could be deemed negligent if an incident occurs, as it demonstrates a lack of due diligence in identifying and mitigating actual threats. Adopting security measures that are overly complex or expensive without a clear justification of their necessity based on a risk assessment is also an incorrect approach. While appearing robust, these measures may divert resources from more critical areas and do not necessarily provide superior protection. This can be seen as a failure to manage resources effectively and to implement security in a proportionate and risk-based manner, which is a core tenet of professional security practice. Focusing exclusively on visible security deterrents, such as uniformed guards, without addressing underlying systemic vulnerabilities, is another incorrect approach. While visible security can have a deterrent effect, it is often insufficient on its own to prevent determined adversaries. This approach neglects the need for a layered security strategy that includes both preventative and detective controls, and it fails to address the root causes of security risks. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should first conduct a thorough and documented risk assessment, identifying all potential threats, vulnerability, and the potential impact on the organization. This assessment should then inform the selection of security controls, prioritizing those that offer the best risk reduction for the investment. The decision-making process should be iterative, involving regular reviews and adjustments to security measures as the threat landscape evolves. Transparency with stakeholders regarding the rationale behind security investments based on the risk assessment is also crucial. Question 20. Benchmark analysis indicates that a client requests a deviation from standard data access protocols to expedite a project, citing time constraints. The security specialist is aware that this deviation, while potentially faster, introduces known vulnerabilities and bypasses established security controls designed to protect sensitive information. What is the most appropriate course of action for the certified security specialist? Option A. Inform the client that the request cannot be fulfilled and end the discussion without further explanation. Option B. Implement the requested deviation immediately to meet the client's deadline, as the client is in a position of authority. Option C. Attempt to find a technical workaround that bypasses the specific protocol but still adheres to the spirit of the security policy without formal approval. Option D. Clearly explain the security risks and regulatory implications of the requested deviation to the client. Refuse to implement the deviation without proper authorization and risk assessment, and document the interaction. The correct answer is D. Clearly explain the security risks and regulatory implications of the requested deviation to the client. Refuse to implement the deviation without proper authorization and risk assessment, and document the interaction. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's request and the security specialist's ethical and legal obligations. The client's desire to bypass standard security protocols for expediency, while seemingly harmless from their perspective, could expose the organization to significant risks, including data breaches, regulatory noncompliance, and reputational damage. The security specialist must exercise careful judgment to balance client needs with their duty to protect sensitive information and uphold industry standards. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves clearly communicating the risks associated with the client's request and explaining the necessity of adhering to established security protocols. This upholds the professional's ethical duty to advise clients responsibly and to prioritize security best practices. Legally, this aligns with the general duty of care expected of security professionals and adherence to any applicable data protection regulations, e.g., GDPR if the jurisdiction were the UK, or relevant US federal/state laws if US. By documenting the request and the rationale for refusal, the specialist creates a clear audit trail, demonstrating due diligence and mitigating personal liability. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with the client's request without proper authorization or risk assessment is a significant ethical and legal failure. It demonstrates a disregard for established security policies and potentially violates data protection laws by exposing sensitive information to unauthorized access or compromise. This action could lead to severe penalties, including fines and legal action, and damage the reputation of both the specialist and their organization. Simply refusing the request without providing a clear explanation or offering alternative, secure solutions is also professionally deficient. While it avoids the immediate risk of noncompliance, it fails to meet the ethical obligation of client service and education. A more constructive approach would involve explaining the security rationale and exploring if a secure, compliant alternative can be found. Attempting to find a workaround that technically bypasses a policy but is perceived as less secure by the specialist without formal approval or risk assessment is a dangerous middle ground. This approach still carries significant risk and can be seen as circumventing established controls, potentially leading to the same negative consequences as directly complying with the risky request. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. First, thoroughly understand the client's request and the underlying business need. Second, assess the request against established security policies, legal requirements, and ethical guidelines. Third, clearly articulate the risks and implications of the request to the client, referencing specific policies or regulations where applicable. Fourth, explore and propose secure, compliant alternatives if the original request cannot be met. Finally, document all communications, decisions, and actions taken. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are well-reasoned, defensible, and prioritize the protection of information and organizational integrity.